Hello and welcome to Books from Your Therapist, a podcast where we talk to therapists and mental health practitioners about their mental health related book recommendations. By mixing book talk with mental health, we hope to open up the conversation around books your therapist may have suggested and make them more accessible.
This podcast is not a substitute for mental health care. It's for educational and entertainment purposes only. I'm Amanda Throckmorton, a marriage and family therapist in California.
And I'm Tara Kremen, and I work in the book industry in Toronto, in Canada. In this episode, we're talking to Dr. Adam Dorsay about his new book, Super Psyched, Unleash the Power of the 4 Types of Connection and Live the Life You Love. Adam is a licensed psychologist and executive coach in Silicon Valley, where he works with high-achieving adults, including professionals, executives, entrepreneurs, and professional athletes. Adam is the host of Super Psyched, an award-winning podcast with over 200 episodes available on all platforms. He's given 2 highly regarded TEDx talks, one about men and their emotions and the other about friendships in adulthood.
Adam's book, Super Psyched, is all about connection. In providing nearly 20,000 hours of intensive psychotherapy, Adam has effectively treated hundreds of patients from all types of backgrounds. The common thread he noticed is that they all struggled with the same sense of seemingly unshakable unhappiness. Super Psyched explores how restoring or creating the deep bonds of connection to what truly matters in our lives can lead to happiness. Packed with actionable advice, unforgettable stories, and unexpected insights, Super Psyched is the ultimate handbook for unleashing the power of connection to live the life you love.
And for our second book, we're discussing Thanks a Thousand by A.J. Jacobs. In this book, New York Times bestselling author A.J. Jacobs decided to thank every single person involved in producing his morning cup of coffee. The resulting journey takes him across the globe, transforms his life, and reveals secrets about how gratitude can make us all happier, more generous, and more connected. It was a really great conversation. We talked a lot about positive psychology and just gratitude in general, and we were so excited to have Adam on and could have kept talking.
Hello, Adam. Welcome to Books from Your Therapist.
I'm so happy to be with you, Amanda and Tara. I just loved getting to know you in the green room for a moment, and the two of you are incredible.
Well, welcome. And I was hoping you could start us out just kind of introing who you are, any parts of your identity you want to share, and just giving the listeners a little bit of insight into you.
Absolutely. I was born to be a therapist. My mom says that when she used to push me in the stroller in San Francisco, I would make eyes at everybody. I was trying to connect from a very young age. And sadly, as I grew up, I didn't have the ability to connect very well. I had quite a spectacular neurodivergence in the form of ADHD and other things that prevented me from connecting well. So I really had to work on this skill. I grew up being placed into special education courses, marinating in the idea for many years that I would not go to college, let alone be any form of academic or intellectual success. And fortunately, there were things that were done along the way and things that I did. And it took me a long time to bloom. In fact, I would say that I really didn't kind of begin to really become myself in a fuller way until I was around 27. And when the ADHD was identified, and for the next 5 years, I worked on that with every ounce of my being through therapy, through my own kind of self-induced, I called it my own Navy SEAL buds training, where I just was gung-ho, realizing that if I wanted to be a husband and a father someday, that I needed to have certain skills at my ready at all times. And most people wouldn't know that I have ADHD today. It's the inattentive type. It's the Hans Christian Andersen looking out the window, wondering what the squirrels are up to type. I was never swinging from a chandelier, to borrow from Sia. But it's been a really important part of my own journey. I've benefited so much from therapy. I always wanted to be a therapist. I ended up marrying a woman who was, or still is, a therapist. And every day we would talk about our days. And I would think to myself, oh my gosh, what an existential regret I'll have if I don't enter the field And so I made the leap with her support to complete a doctorate later in life and get paid $10 an hour with no benefits for 3,000 hours of internship. And she supported me the entire way. And it's been one of the most important parts of my journey. I'm a father. I'm also a pet, very hardcore pet dad. Dogs and cats, I go both ways. Although I would love to have other types of pets as well at some point in my life. And that's a little bit about me.
It sounds like, well, in your words, like you were sort of destined to be a therapist, which is, I think, the first time we've had someone say that so explicitly on here. Like,
Mm,
I feel like everyone really has their own journey towards the work. Like, I know for me, it was like a building blocks of things that I thought weren't connected, but they actually were, that led me into this work. And so that's just like such a fun piece to share about you. Like,
mm.
you were a people person from the very get-go and had your own journey to get here, which you highlight very well in the book, alongside your new love for cats, which I had to appreciate, as you mentioned, being a pet dad. So, can you share a little bit about like who you've worked with and where you work in the field?
Sure. I've worked with a broad variety. I worked with gang affiliated youth during my internship at Asian Americans for Community Involvement. One of the reasons they hired me is because I speak Spanish and Japanese, and that was kind of my way into such a wonderful uh, postdoctoral internship. I also worked at the Center for Survivors of Torture, where I heard about some pretty awful things from people who've come from countries where they were put through horrors that were inconceivable to me. I remember being told by my then supervisor, who said that, listen, you are going to hear things that are going to change you. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And by the way, from that idea, I realized that Nietzsche and Kelly Clarkson got it wrong when they said what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. It's actually how you cope with what didn't kill you that makes you stronger. You could actually become much weaker from the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And hearing those stories could make me much weaker. When you have that midnight pee and you start thinking about one of the clients who told you something so horrible, I don't want to mention
Mm-hmm.
any of the types of torture, it would blow your mind. And subsequently, I worked at a geriatric facility for a minute and then really went hard on my private practice. Now, this is all after my corporate experience in the US and Japan, where I had various jobs and different titles. And those actually helped me in my private practice because the second a guy knocked on my door and said, hey, I'm a C-level executive. I've never checked my emotions. My marriage is going really, really badly. I don't know how to father my children. Some people at work are saying that my intellectual functioning is amazing, but my EQ, my emotional intelligence is not commensurate with that. So all of those things that I learned over the years came to the fore when I entered private practice. And I specialize in working with men, generally high achieving, high functioning men. At one point, Facebook called me. It was known then as Facebook. They needed somebody to help them attend to the trust and safety department, the counterterrorism, the child safety, the people who see horrible, horrible things that can
Mm.
happen when a billion people are online. Some of the players are not going to be awesome. I mean, it's a small minority, but it's a substantial number of horrible things that go on. And the people were experiencing what we call in our field vicarious trauma. They weren't the direct recipient of the traumatic behavior, but seeing such horrible things caused their worldview to change a bit. Like, oh my gosh, people can do this. Similar to what I experienced at the Center for Survivors of Torture.
Mm.
So I came in, they interviewed me to see if I was a fit, and I wasn't really sure what I was going to say at the time. And I suddenly found myself saying, it's going to be a two-way TED Talk. I will be the facilitator. I'll bring in experts who either specialize in something super light, like positive psychology, so that you can foster greater resilience. So it's post-traumatic growth rather than, other types of PTS, because we can get vicarious PTS. And at other times, I'll bring in people attending to really dark matters, such as psychopathy, terrorism. I'll bring in experts, and I will be the constant touch point. I will be the mediator. I'll be the guy who kind of runs color commentary. And it went swimmingly. I was there for 4 years, and subsequently DigitalOcean, another wonderful cloud computing company, called me up and said, hey, we want your services. So I've been doing that for about 10 years. Yeah, actually 10 years now. Between those two things that I do, as well as, of course, running a podcast, which was born in COVID, my father very sweetly said to me, hey, you're not driving your kids to school. You got a few extra hours a week. You've always wanted to have a podcast. Thanks, Dad. Great idea. So next thing you know, I had this podcast, and we're coming on the 250th episode shortly. Some really great people have been on it. My nickname is Enthusiasm, a name I earned in my high school garage band when I was the bass player, and it just fit. And so I called. It's kind of an enthusiasm name. Super Psyched, also the name of the book. Super Psyched, just to be clear, is not meant to be peddling toxic positivity. It's super connected to our psyches, is what it's meant to mean, that we are really connected with what we're feeling. It could be profound grief. It could be joy. It could be anything in between and other, but being real and authentic. So that's been spectacularly fun. And last but not least, I've given a couple TEDx talks, one on men and emotions, another on friendship and adulthood. I've loved geeking out to those. As you might imagine, doing a TEDx talk takes about 100 hours of prep if you do it right, I believe. And those have also been really foundational in who I am and my work.
It's interesting to hear. Well, first off, the tech piece is cool to hear about, because I also live in the Bay Area. So I have a lot of community that works in tech. And I think about the moderators on these social platforms. And so it's cool to hear sort of on the other side what type of support is offered, at least on some of these platforms, for folks that are doing that job. Because, yeah, maybe it's a small percentage, but it doesn't make it less traumatic or triggering to be sitting in that all day. So thank you for your contribution there.
My pleasure.
Also, you mentioned this, you just touched on it briefly, but I'm curious because the book talks a lot about positive psychology, and we have a lot of different types of folks on here that use, different theory and different ways to work with people. So I was wondering if you could just describe for listeners what positive psychology is.
Absolutely. It's basically happiness under a microscope. Up until around the year 2000, when Martin Seligman became, I believe maybe it was even 98, but regardless, became the president of the American Psychological Association, there were 100 studies on depression to one on happiness. Happiness was not something the field was willing to touch with a 10-foot pole. It seemed too flaky. And as we were talking about offline, sometimes the flaky stuff actually becomes, heliocentrism. Back in the day when it was proposed that the Earth was not at the center of our solar system, that the sun was, it was considered crazy and even an offense. But positive psychology has taken its incredible amounts of academic rigor and made it one of the most heavily researched arms of all of psychology to compensate for the possibility that it might be perceived as something flaky. Again, it's not peddling toxic positivity. It's looking for authentic happiness or fulfillment. You could substitute the word fulfillment for happiness if happiness is somehow unpleasant. But some of the things that they found is that researching gratitude, for example, actually changes our brain over time. Imaging studies show that certain parts of the prefrontal cortex actually change, and it helps to override something that has kept us alive throughout the millennia, but doesn't help us thrive today. And that would be something called the negativity bias. The negativity bias is when I hear rustling in the leaves, I imagine it must be a tiger, but it's actually a squirrel. But to keep my future children alive or my bloodline intact in my own life, it's better to have a false positive and imagine it's something that it's not than to have a false negative and find out, oh my gosh, it's actually something that can kill me. That's why when we go on vacation and 100 great things happened and one or two bad things happened, we're often remembering the one or two bad things rather than the other 100. So positive psychology addresses this. It basically is kind of a Control-Alt-Delete on the system, if you can use an old computer term, of looking at the system defaults and saying, hey, how can we really hack into the system and actually live happier lives. One of the things that it's found is that it's been good for almost every element of our functioning. We sleep better, our immune systems are stronger, we're more pleasant to be around, a lot less Debbie Downerism of people, showing up and trying to make the common denominator of the meeting something negative, but rather it helps us become a little bit more, let's say, Amy Poehler in Parks and Recreation, and a lot less, oh, I don't know, insert person from Game of Thrones. So it's been lovely. I actually did my doctoral dissertation on using positive psychological interventions as an adjunct modality to ordinary therapy. It's not positive psychology is not meant to be like a substitute for cognitive behavioral therapy or humanistic therapy or any of the other 600 known modalities that have been researched. It's more of an add-on. So if you can imagine, like in Google Chrome, when you have these add-ons, that's what positive psychology is. It's on board and ready to go as an add-on to virtually any form of psychotherapy. So I love it. I've geeked out to it. When I found out that this was a thing, I couldn't consume enough of it. And I'm still absolutely obsessed with it.
I'm always very curious about the writing part of any author guests that we have. So I wanted to just ask you, have you always been a writer? Like what led up to this? Like did your work in therapy lead to writing or vice versa? Is it something that you've always done in the background?
It's interesting. One of the things that we've studied in positive psychology has been the concept of flow. It comes from a guy whose name is very difficult to pronounce, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who sadly passed. Brilliant man who really studied the idea of immersion. When you are really using your talents and being challenged, and how you lose track of time. So 3 hours could feel like 30 minutes. And suddenly you look at your clock. And writing has been that for me. I can lose myself in writing. My writing is okay. It's good. It's not great, but the ideas are there. And thankfully, that's where editors come in to make it really sing in my voice. And oddly enough, in addition to the publishing company with whom I worked, who did a very good job on the editing and helping me with concision, and person who did probably the biggest lifting was actually my own wife. My wife sat next to me at one point, and we were like two people sitting at a piano writing a song. I'd come to her with a completed manuscript, and I didn't love it. This was about 15 months in. So it took me about 20 months in total. So I come to her in the middle. I feel like I'm in the middle of the desert. I was like, it's done, but I don't love it. And she just said, let me just hear how you're doing this. She knows my voice. And she was able to take it from more of a Wikipedia-like recitation of the facts to my voice of storytelling. And for that, I'm infinitely grateful. I called her the piano tuner. She basically tuned the book. The words and the ideas were largely the same, but she was able to find ways to put in, we'll call them verbal emojis. She was able to make it more of an emotionally connected book rather than just an intellectually on point one. So I'm really grateful to her for that. It's one of the hardest things I've ever done. I actually thought it was harder than doing my dissertation, actually, because it was so much more public. And with a dissertation, you can, write out a thing that is also difficult, but it's understood that it's not meant to be utterly captivating and unputdownable. And I've tried to create a book that is that.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of yourself in this book, so I can understand the difficulty of that with like something that's so academic versus really putting your own personality and a lot of yourself into the book. And I listened to the audiobook as well, so it was very much you were in my head. I could hear your voice throughout and enjoyed reading or
I'm
listening.
so happy to hear that. The recording was also one of the hardest things I've ever done. And I've heard the same thing from other authors who've done the recordings of their books. I did it on a music stand in my own bedroom. There was an engineer out of England who was listening to me. And I must say, I was so exhausted when imagine dyslexia and trying to read the book and also come in with your authentic personality. It was very, very hard for me. Apparently, it listens better at 1.2 to 1.5 speed than actual 1.0 speed, is what I've been told by many people, but that it does read well if you listen to it just a little bit faster.
Well, thank you too for You really brought in the vulnerability piece with your process. I think sometimes maybe there's an assumption that books just completely flow out of people. Like, even if these are big ideas that you feel all the time and that and there's like this connection to it, doesn't mean that it's just this flowing process. And I think it's important for people to hear that, yeah, this was hard, right? Like, this was a hard process that is truly a labor of love. Thank you for sharing that piece. I think it's nice for people to go like, oh, okay, like, this was a hard process. Maybe if I wanted to do something like this, it would be hard for me too. But look, he has this published book, you know?
Exactly. And the other weird thing about it, of course, is now people are going to know things about me that will be on the
Right.
permanent record, so to speak. Some of the people who see me professionally read it and say, wow, I know a lot more about you. I
Mm-hmm.
remember listening, I believe his name is Ron Tafel. I'm maybe pronouncing his last name incorrectly. He was giving a lecture on appropriate, judicious self disclosure in the context of therapy. I was trained not to do any form of self disclosure. And the book essentially is a massive self disclosure. But one of the things I really wanted to embody, it's kind of a cost benefit analysis and a risk benefit analysis by sharing of myself so fully. It was my hope. And I believe that more than 90% of the readers will think, yes, indeed, he's modeling what it looks like to be authentic, to be very vulnerable.
So, Super Psyched, unleash the power of the 4 types of connection and live the life you love. So, what motivated you to write Super Psyched?
It's so funny. Irvin Yalom, who's one of the MVPs of all time, and you're nodding, he was one of the forerunners of existential psychotherapy. Taught at Stanford, did a lot of group therapy work. But he said that every book he ever wrote, and they're all amazing, every book he ever wrote bit him in the ass. I love that expression. This book, it was like a dog. It took hold of me. After nearly 20,000 hours of providing therapy, after doing all these podcast episodes and talking to some of the world's brightest and reading lots of books, the word connection just kept showing up as the thing. And there weren't really any books about connection in and of itself. There were books on connecting with your spouse, of course, a lot of that. Connecting with your children, plenty of that as well. Connecting with your clients, for sure. But what about all of the ways that we connect? And actually, I was able to identify 4. How we connect with ourselves is the primary one. If you can imagine them rippling out like concentric circles. The second category would be connecting with others, as I'm connecting with the 2 of you right now, or me connecting with my wife or my children or even my pets. The third circle is connecting with the world. The world includes things like work, it includes art, it includes nature and other aspects. And the fourth is connecting with something greater. Now, some people are orthodox atheists, but even they experience something greater when they go to the Grand Canyon, when they experience awe. Awe is usually the internal experience when we externally say, wow, Grand Canyon, wow, Castle in Ireland, wow, anywhere in Marin, wow, just big wows. And what we found is that religious or not, we all experience something greater. And even just connecting with the 2 of you right now, I'm experiencing something greater than me alone. Me just talking would be a lot less dynamic. And the 3 of us together are greater than the sum of our parts, in my opinion. And that is also something greater. So I had to write this book. If you think about it, in the DSM, which is, the holy Bible of diagnosis in the mental health world, every pathology just about has within it disconnection. Anxiety is disconnecting from the present because we're thinking about the future. Depression is disconnecting from the present because we're thinking about the past or ruminating. Trauma, my goodness, we dissociate. And psychosis, well, that's disconnecting from reality itself. So if disconnection is at the heart of everything we want, connection seems logical that it'd be at the heart of everything we do want. And it's my contention that it's the precursor for everything we want. It's the precursor to authenticity, to happiness, to, for example, me finding my path as being a psychologist. That was a connection move. It was hard. It was inconvenient. It's It was one of the most important things I've ever done. Connecting with your spouse, connecting with yourself, knowing deep down, like one of the things I see so frequently in my office is people just so sad about who they chose as a spouse because they didn't connect more deeply with themselves. They said yes to a no. They said, yes, I'll marry you, even though inside they thought it was a no, but they thought maybe things will change. Maybe when we throw a baby into the equation, the love will grow. Maybe he or she will change. And of course, that doesn't, as a betting person, pretend very well. So I really was hoping to write a book that would help people find their own connection formulas to themselves and figure out how they wanted to connect with others, the world, and something greater in their own way. It's my hope that all 8 billion of us on the planet have some tools to find those connections, because the dash between our birth date and our death date is dependent on our capacity to connect. No one on their deathbed ever said, hey, can you bring me all of the awards I've won over my life? And our coffins do not have pockets in them. What matters is our connections. That's what we think about on our deathbed. That's what we need to be thinking about during our lives. And there wasn't even a good definition for the word connection in the Webster Dictionary or the APA dictionary. None of the definitions were great. So I actually called upon many of my colleagues and friends in the field, one of whom actually was Harville Hendricks, who's one of the leaders in couple therapy. His episode on Oprah was her first Emmy, massive contribution to the field, called imago therapy. And he looked at it as well. And basically, we sum it up in well over a page, what it means. But it's that aliveness we feel, that vitality, that life force that we feel when we know something is true. We feel it. You know it when it's happening. And sometimes you'll meet somebody who, intellectually, we should be a match, and yet it's not there. And then you meet somebody else and it's like, oh my gosh, where have you been all my life? And that could be music. It could be work. It could be a place that shocks you. I mean, I remember getting off the plane in Italy and saying to myself, everything here is everything I want. Like, I love this place. My whole body told me so. We know it when it's real. And I've been to places where I was told it was awesome and I didn't feel it.
You're speaking to so many things, and this point about connection, you kind of named like maybe choosing the wrong partner, or if you have anxiety, depression, psychosis, trauma, like all of these things are disconnectors. But what are some of the common things you see that get in the way of people getting to connection? Maybe more conscious choices that people are making.
And as you can tell from my body, I get very excited when just talking about this just brings me alive. Yesterday, I was actually on a writer's group and we were talking about how good is it to be on podcasts. And many of the authors, not surprisingly, are introverted, and it takes a lot out of them. For me, this is like everything I want. So I'm feeling super connected talking about the topic and with both of you in our 3 locations. But some of the most common I'm going to call them nasty fish in the disconnection aquarium. And it's important to name them because we need to name them to be aware of them. As Jung once said, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will drive us and we'll think it was fate. It's really important to give a name to these. A big one is FOMO. It's been all the more present after social media came onto the scene. I remember when I was just a young budding therapist, so to speak, and somebody brought up what was then MySpace, and I said, "Oh, this will never be a thing." Oh, it's a character in therapy. I saw this on Facebook, and I'm devastated to see that, my friend did not include me in this thing. I would say that FOMO is one of the biggest fish in the aquarium. So big that Patrick McGinnis, who coined the term, who was a guest on my podcast, wrote a book called FOMO Sapiens. And it's brilliant. And my buddy, colleague, amazing human being, AJ Jacobs, suggested the term JOMO. What about the joy of missing out? What about the joy of just leaning into what you've got this evening? Perhaps it's you with your pet. Perhaps it's you with your partner. Perhaps it's you alone, just really enjoying a book or whatever it is that's true for you. There is joy to missing out as well. And if you went to that thing, you might actually drive home and think, yeah, I made my footprint there. And those are 3 hours I'll never get back. So oftentimes FOMO is what I would call a red herring. It seems like it's going to be awesome, and it turns out to not be. If it's the driver, it really distracts us from connecting with our truth. Another one is social comparison. This is a big one. You want to feel really bad about something that could make you feel really good? Compare yourself to someone else. I remember rolling in with my new car, and in my neighborhood, people have really nice cars. My car was, I think it's fantastic, but I know unequivocally that the cars around me are 2x to 3x more expensive. But one of the things I also know is that there's certain passages from the Bible that got it right. And I'm sorry that it's gendered, but the term is he who is happy with his lot is rich. And we also know that what we appreciate appreciates. So what I would ask people to do when they engage in social comparison and say, oh my gosh, the injustice, or my gosh, my thing sucks relative to theirs. I mean, my body relative to Chris Hemsworth sucks, but my body relative to what it was last year is better than it was. So I ask people to compare themselves to themselves, compare themselves to who they were in the past and how are they trending. That's the only measure that matters. There are social research elements to this idea, but comparing ourselves relatively to another usually will engage us in social comparison. It's a losing proposition. But comparing ourselves to ourselves based on our progress. There are several other things that get in the way. Of course, I love Esther Perel and Stan Tatkin, who talk about thirds. Thirds are anything that can get in the way between you and your intended person that you should be relating to. Imagine I'm talking to you and I'm texting at the same time. The phone has become a third. Work can be a third. A family member can be a third. A pet can be a third. It's really important to be aware of the thirds because they can really disconnect us from the people we're with. And that alluring glance of the blue light from the phone saying, feed me, look at me, consume me. I know I'm being really almost dramatic, but it's true. It's the draw, and I need to find out what's going on social media. And I'm going to ask people, consume less, create more. There was a poet who described it as kind of touching heaven or the hand of God when we're in creator mode. This as podcasters and as people in literature and psychotherapy, that when we're creating, that's when our true selves come out. When we're consuming, it's like eating too many Skittles and you feel sick afterwards. I'm going to say create more, consume less. So there are many ways that we disconnect. Those are some of the ways that I describe in the book of reconnecting. The book is meant to be a menu in certain ways for you to find your own path for connection, because I can't tell how it would be absurd for me to say, hey, you want to connect? Here's how you do it. But I can tell you what are the disconnectors in the aquarium. I can tell you some of the places you might connect and to consider.
Thanks for saying the line that I had written down from your book of what you appreciate appreciates, because that really stuck with me, and you glossed by it very quickly there. So I just wanted to highlight that piece again.
Can I just riff off that for a second? Because it's just so fun. But what we appreciate appreciates. It's just so true. One of the things that I do, it's almost a meditation in the car. Virtually every time I hit the start button, I think to myself, what a great car. I love my car. It's not going to turn heads ever, but it's the nicest car I've ever had. And the OEM tires sucked. So I forked out some money, got some new tires. And one of the things that I joke about with my family, because it's going to show up virtually on every drive, I will always say something akin to, isn't this an amazing car? And the second thing is, these tires rock. Like these are the most amazing tires ever. So, and it's true for me. I'm not faking this. This is really my truth. I love this thing. Would it be more amazing to have 3x expensive car? Sure, perhaps, but I don't. And I'm not allocating my funds for that. That's not where my money goes. But I can double down and lean into my love for the thing I've got.
You talked a bit about flow very briefly there. And just as you were saying about leaning into creativity and like losing yourself within flow, or like losing time, I liked that you described it as like the overlap of meaning and challenge. But you used flow in an interesting way in your book where you brought it to how we can find flow in work. And as the corporate part of this podcast in my like corporate day job, I find it interesting because I do usually associate flow with like play or like the downtime piece. So could you talk a little bit about like finding flow in work?
I'm guessing, Tara, that at your work, there is something that just hits the geeky spot of your heart that makes you so happy to be there. There are things that you hate about work, of course. Nobody's job is perfect. But there are certain strengths that you probably rock at work that are meaningful to you. And what's great about positive psychology, they actually identify the 24 character strengths that are ubiquitous all around the planet, all throughout time, regardless of country, religion, language spoken. And I'm guessing that this is just going to be a shot in the dark, but that you're probably a fairly curious person. It's not a crazy guess because you're a podcast host and you're inquiring. But I'm guessing that being in the world of literature and really tapping into your curiosity will make it more pleasant. Some of us don't have jobs that we can leave. Some of us really don't. There is a story of a single mom who had, just by life circumstances, had to be a food server. She was educated, but she was a single mom, and that was literally all she could do given the constraints in her life. And she hated food serving. She hated it. It was beneath her in her mind. And then she did a study on the character strengths and found out that one of her top strengths was interpersonal strengths, kind of like a human connection. I'm describing the strength not perfectly in terms of the wording used by the measure, but you get the idea. And so she decided to lean into that for every shift. So previously, every shift she'd have dread, and a 4-hour shift felt like 16. But when she leaned into the strength that she valued at work, they're called values in action even, she was able to enjoy work. Her tips went up. Her 4-hour shifts felt like an hour. And that was the same for me when I was relegated to bank teller. I hated being a bank teller, but I tried to find a way to experience flow in it. And this was long before the VIA questionnaire was on board. And I was reading Viktor Frankl's great master work where he describes finding meaning in the darkest of situations, one of the darkest moments in human history, in Auschwitz, when people around him were being killed, when he lost everything and everyone. And he said, we are left with one final freedom, and that is the freedom to choose how we interpret a thing. So I decided, well, Frankl would have killed to be in my situation. Okay, boo-hoo, I'm a grad student and I'm a bank teller. Big deal. It's not so bad. I just felt like I was treated like a piece of meat. I called myself a meat-based ATM. And I realized I'm seeing 120 people. Back then, we saw a lot of people. And they're all different walks of life. Well, what if I was to use that time to try to connect with 120 of them, maybe make 119 of them smile and laugh and balance at the end of the day? That was my challenge. And so we can all find this in our work. My shifts went by really fast, and it ultimately became the best training ground I've ever had for connecting with people of any walk of life. I would recommend that you find your geek spot at work. If you need to change jobs, and you can, fantastic. But in the meantime, ask yourself, what can I learn here? How can I turn this job into a .edu proposition? How can I say I will be better every day in some way by learning something here? So if you're working at Google, it's not google.com, it's google.edu. It's a well-paid internship where you're learning new skills that are transferable. And for you, Tara, I'm sure every day you're getting smarter. I'm looking at the bookshelf behind you for those who can't see. There are thoughts of probably some of the most brilliant people who've ever lived right behind you, from which you can have a better life and a better experience engaging all of the 4 dimensions of connection.
Before it gets lost, I should say, you had mentioned the connection formula. And so for any listeners that are like, wait, but he didn't tell us what the connection formula is, can you share what is the connection formula that you talk about in the book?
Absolutely. So I'll give an example of what it is. I'll show you what it is. My son just had the pleasure of hiking the Annapurna trail up in Nepal. He went from 2,000 to up to 18,000 feet in the freezing cold, like breathing out, seeing his own breath in his lodgings, these tea houses. Best experience of his life. He was a 10 out of 10 the entire time. Had I been on that trip, there's no way I would consider that fun. That is not part of my connection formula, but it was absolutely consistent with his. Tonight, he's going to be doing a 15-mile walk in the dark. He loves this stuff. His connection formula, the way he feels connected to himself, is very different than the way I would. For me, I have my own things that I absolutely adore doing, but I wouldn't be so brash as to impose my formula on someone else. So one of the things that I do in the book is I look at various activities that people can engage in so that they feel more connected. Many of them relate to creation and doing things rather than just mere consumption. I'm a big fan of consumption. Let me just be clear. I do go on to social media for a measured amount of time every day, but it's measured because I know I could get lost. And then we ask ourselves, where did my weekend go? And we return to work non-rejuvenated. I call these non-rejuvenating rabbit holes that we get into and we think they're going to be rejuvenating, but they're not. So they're distractors from the connection formula. The connection formula is really looking at the things that we want to do. Sometimes they're bucket list items and sometimes they're much smaller. Like I know I need to meditate every day. Something that I've been sadly not been doing as much as I should. But I know that is part of my connection formula. And when I do that, I feel much more connected on all four areas. But somebody else might say, oh my God, I hate meditating. But what I do love doing is, journaling or whatever it is, but do that thing that you know that you love that will give you a return on your energy. And most of the time, it requires a little activation energy. Usually to actually do these things are a little bit harder than just hitting the Roku and turning on Netflix, which is a very easy thing to do. And I love doing it, but I also know I got to create. In my case, my son's got to do the nighttime or the cold hikes. My dad will watch a 6-hour Wagnerian opera. I would call it a very expensive place to sleep. I like shorter operas, but a 6-hour one, I forget it. And we've got to be real. I was also talking about the idea that there's certain places that people tell you are the best places on earth and you go there and you don't feel it. Connection formula. We all need to identify the things that will feed us for the 4 areas of connection. And it's individual for all of us. None of us is a perfect duplicate of another.
Modern friendship is something that's of interest to Amanda and I, and we've talked about it on the podcast before, and your book has a chapter dedicated to it. So could you maybe talk a little bit about why it feels, or maybe this is just part of getting older, but sometimes it feels like friendship is so difficult now, and how can listeners find more meaningful friendships as adults?
Absolutely. So I'm going to, if I may, Tara, I'm going to use you as an example because you are very much like so many people who live right here in the Bay Area. You grew up in Cork. You spent time on an island in Korea. You're now in Toronto. Is that okay that I've revealed that?
Yeah, that's totally fine. I lived in England as well.
You lived in England as well.
Yeah,
and I
as a
can only
child.
imagine that you, as a fun, charming person, left friends behind in each place with the spectacular intention of remaining in touch. But due to geography and the distance, it was harder to maintain these. And this is what I see all the time. In the Bay Area, people have been born in various places, educated others, had internships here and moved around. And then they're finally here and, oh my gosh, I only have my spouse. And that is way too much pressure on the primary relationship. Because as Esther Perel says, we used to live in villages and now we expect that all of the villagers' roles are imposed on that one person. That's too much for a marriage. So the question is, why friendship? Well, we need friendship. There's an interesting study that Todd Kashdan described to me. He's a wonderful professor at George Mason, where you look at a hill and there are 2 groups looking at this hill. And each group has to imagine how hard it will be from 1 to 10. Group 1 is looking at it alone, imagines the hill's about a 9 out of 10 in terms of difficulty. The second group is with a friend. And it goes down spectacularly. I don't remember the exact number, but let's say it's 5. That perceived support that we experience. I don't know if you ever have been working out and having somebody spot you when you're bench pressing, but they might just put a finger under the barbell when you're doing that last rep. But that finger, which is exuding, I don't know, probably a pound of energy, it feels to the person benching like spectacular support. So we need friends. Our social brains require some kind of companionship, unless, of course, we're really out there with certain things, various neurodiverse aspects, including, sadly, psychopathy. Psychopaths can seem like great friends, but they will use you and they will bleed you. And some friends will feed you, and some friends will, as I say, bleed you. The friend who feeds you is the one who has a really lovely ability to exchange in a reciprocal way, that upload and download, rather than saying it's bringing it all back to themselves. And I use this thing called a drive-away test. How do you feel after having been with this person for a period of time? Do you feel taller? Do you feel happier? Do you feel in some ways fed? Or do you feel tired? Do you feel somehow used? We can all experience those things. And so one of the things I really want to do, and I was so glad to see in the last few years, great thought leaders, as I mentioned, like Esther Perel and others, are talking about friendship at a very high level. So that was one of the reasons I dedicated my TEDx talk to this idea. We need friends. One of the best ways to find friends is to reinvigorate old friends. Look through your contacts and ask yourself, who have I let fall by the wayside? I don't need to have somebody in person. It's great to have people in person, and I prefer it. But even now, we're looking at each other on Zoom. We see the nonverbal expressions on the face. And that's one of the things that we can do with any relationship. People say I'm on Zoom all week at work. It's different when you're with a friend and you make it cocktail time or coffee time or whatever it is, and you can talk about real things. I can virtually guarantee you, no matter how introverted you are, having intermittent virtual connections with your friends on that level will help. But the other thing you can do is the vulnerable thing and try to find friends who are local. And in adulthood, that's hard. The ratio of pings to like real friends and the amount of time it takes to cultivate a real friendship can seem a little daunting. The numbers in terms of the hours vary in terms of how long it takes to make a real friend. What we want to do is see that they're fairly consistent over time, that they show up when they're reliable. They show up when they say they're going to show up. They are able to really, really hold your confidential information confidential. So I really have given it a lot of thought. I am a huge proponent. I believe it will impact every aspect of our life. Last night, I had dinner with my buddy, David, and I came home and it was a fairly demanding day. Let's just say it was 8 hours back to back. And then I went out and saw my friend, and I'm an ambivert. I wouldn't say I'm totally an extrovert, but somewhere in the middle. And I drove home feeling on top of the world. So highly recommend that you invest in friendship.
Your book is broken down with chapters dedicated to different areas of connection. The friendship one was really kind of what popped out to me, but readers can really go through and find any areas that are relevant to them as they're going through. So I was kind of curious, as a whole, what do you hope the reader takes away from your book?
I hope they take away the motivation to look at one thing at a time, to ask themselves, which aspects of my connectivity do I want to address? One at a time. They say you chase two rabbits, you get neither. But I hope that they will use it consistently to find fulfillment in any or all of the four areas that are connective, and that they are more conscious and intentional about how they use that thing called time, the one non-renewable resource that we have. We can lose our health and get it back. We can lose our money and get it back, but we can't lose our time and get it back. And the more time we spend in connection, I believe, is directly related to how meaningful our lives are.
Let's move on to the book of your choosing, which is the second book pick, Thanks 1,000 by A.J. Jacobs. So why did you pick this book?
This is a masterpiece. A.J. Jacobs is one of the greatest people ever. And anybody who's read his stuff knows this. He's the guy who will put himself through any form of experiment that won't hurt him, of course, but that He's so curious. His first big book, he read the entire Encyclopedia Britannica, all 30,000 plus pages in that tiny font and these huge pages. And he read the whole thing in a year and wrote about the experience. One year he lived for the entire year to the letter according to the Old Testament on my year of living biblically. In this particular book, Thanks 1,000, it was the byproduct of him saying he's not religious, but he's spiritual. And he said, he was thanking the various parties who brought the dinner, the farmer, et al. And one of his kids said, they can't hear it. So what's the point of doing this? And AJ felt, oh my gosh, that's right. What if I was to look at my morning cup of coffee and thank 1,000 people who helped bring this to me? Everybody from the coffee growers to the truck drivers to the people who made the cup for it, the people who made the machine, the people who provided the metal to create the machine, the box creators. There were 1,000 different people who he thanked. Oftentimes they were taken aback, like, what? Like, you're thanking me for this? And they liked it on average. Sometimes they were very warm. Sometimes they were a little bit cool. But he rocked gratitude, which back in the 90s was considered kind of a new agey idea, except for the fact that for thousands of years, various spiritual traditions have endorsed it. But when neuroscience actually corroborates it, oh my gosh, it's amazing. I love it when that happens. I believe Mark Twain, maybe apocryphal, said something like, the older I get, the smarter my parents were. And similarly, these older traditions, obviously some of the things that they come up with, like, stoning people, not endorsed, but the good ones, we have to pick and choose, of course, oftentimes are corroborated by science. These old traditions have so much scientific relevance. So in this case, it was gratitude, something in Judaism that you're supposed to do 108 times a day. But modern science has shown that just recognizing 3 good things or 3 things for which you're thankful and why you're thankful for them can have massive, massive benefits in overriding the negativity bias that we talked about. So AJ describes the reason for why he did this and the process, the story of thanking all of these people. He's probably my favorite person to read before I sleep. There is some evidence that reading something funny will help us sleep. I was delighted by this. My wife and I, even on our vacations, we're so into psychology. We're still reading about psychology, even on our vacations and poolside. We just can't get enough. But she conveyed this piece of research to me, and I was so excited because previously, I'd read like The Kite Runner before bed. Great book, not a great read to induce sleep. It's very stimulating. It's very upsetting. It's a beautiful book, but maybe read that a few hours before sleep. Maybe read AJ on the Kindle or the Kobo before you go to sleep. I have taken to reading on my Kindle Oasis. It's got this lovely blue light blocking feature so that I don't allow my endogenous melatonin to stop showing up. One of the things we know for sure is when we see blue light, it signals to our brain it's time to be alert and awake. And when we're trying to sleep, that's the worst thing we can do. So I'm really grateful for, Kindles and Kobos and other blue light reducing technologies. I think I endorse them. They say, sleep experts say that the only 2 things you should do in your bedroom are sleep and sex. I would add reading on one of these devices as well. And don't do the news before bed. Don't go shopping before bed. Shopping, I've done all these things. I've seen what they do. There have been moments where I don't practice what I preach, for sure, where I find myself, I remember watching Breaking Bad before bed. Really bad idea, it turns out. So Thanks 1,000 is a book I've read and reread, and actually all of AJ's work I've read and reread, and he's the most present party on my podcast. He's appeared 5 times. I could talk to this guy forever. He's the guy. I don't know if you felt this way, but I remember in childhood going over to a friend's house with my new toy or hearing about their new toy and just getting so excited and playing, and it just, the novelty. That's what it's like to talk to AJ all the time about anything. It's always like playing with your favorite toy when you were a kid. He is so much fun. So, in terms of the driveway test with AJ, I always feel like 5x better than I felt before it.
Well, thank you for picking the book. See, this is me expressing my gratitude because it's actually something I was really pleased that you had picked it because I had personally been trying to be a bit more present with expressing gratitude as I think identify a little bit more with AJ as it doesn't come as naturally to me. So the book is really like his journey of like kind of overcoming how it doesn't come naturally to him. But as you've described yourself as like enthusiasm, which I love, do you find being grateful comes very natural to you?
It does. And in fact, it's one of my 5 strengths that was on the VIA is gratitude. It does come very natural. Now, there are times, and my wife will corroborate this, where I go into kind of dark mode or anxious mode. I'm human, it turns out. And it's hard to access gratitude in those moments. And one of the things we know is, and even Rumi, the great Sufi poet, talks about this, is that gratitude and anxiety do not coexist easily. In fact, oftentimes gratitude will supplant anxiety. So one of the things it's not natural. It's the old Native American idea of we have two wolves inside of us, a kind wolf and a bad wolf or an evil wolf, and either one of them can dominate. Now, when I'm sad, I'm not suggesting that I just go into gratitude. Oh my gosh, my cat died. But what if I just get grateful? No, experience the grief. I'm not endorsing not doing that. But there is the real stuff and there is the BS stuff. The guy who thinks he's going to get fired at any second and there's no evidence. That's an irrational form of anxiety. It's coming from childhood. That's not about now. The person who's been put on a, PIP, as they call it, a professional improvement plan, that guy has reason to be anxious. But the one who's got no evidence, but still anxious at any moment, I'm going to be fired. Imposterism is another one of those places. Oftentimes we experience imposter syndrome, and imposter syndrome is very often correlated with actually excellent performance. It's just that we don't feel we are entitled to do it. So gratitude can supplant all of those things. It does come naturally to me. There are moments when it's hard to access. There are moments when I would suggest not accessing it. And to the grief part, I would endorse the idea that at some point you access gratitude for the person or the pet you're sad about having lost, or the job or the friendship that died. Wicked has become very popular these days, and I've always loved that musical. And there's a moment where Glinda and Afalba part ways, and the song is called For the Better. Even if a good friendship sadly comes to an end, we can recognize that we have been changed for the better and access gratitude for that. Last but not least, I used to run pet loss groups, and over my right shoulder is a little pine box, and in it are the ashes of the first cat I ever had, the one who jumped me into the cat gang, Mr. Yoda himself. 23 years ago, he died. Of course, I was crestfallen when he died, but one of the things I endorse in pet loss and all loss is within the eulogy, really attending to the places that we are better for the better, like that song. And for sure, Yoda also helped me get ready to become a father and a husband. He had serious health issues. And with the ADHD that I had to be so regimented and precise and consistent. He taught me a lot. And I don't expect I will ever let go of that box. I look at that box with, a little bit of sadness at times, but always gratitude.
I appreciated in the pet section of your book, the idea of writing a eulogy for your pet. And yeah, I just think sometimes the pet conversation gets lost in grief or loss. So I was like, that's such a good idea. It made me think of the pets I've had in the past. I'm like, I could still do that, right? So I thought that was a great suggestion as a way to just appreciate and find gratitude for the role that pet played and the love that they provided. So I really loved that. I was like, I could still do this. With AJ's book and thanking everyone for the morning coffee, was there anyone that was surprising that AJ reached out to for you?
For sure. Many. I mentioned the box creators, the people who create the crates that transported this coffee. He actually traced from a particular coffee shop in New York. I'm forgetting the name of the coffee shop, but I bought their beans just so I could feel more connected to AJ. And
Is it Java Joe's or
something like that?
I almost said Latte Larry's, but that's something separate.
I think it's something like Java Joe's. It's in the book, and he acknowledges them, and he acknowledges the baristas who were awesome, and kind of the relationships that he cultivated through this prompt of thanking them. Like there, in many cases, there were real connections there. I would say the one that really blew my mind was I believe it was the steel company that made the machines, that he would actually go that far. I don't remember. And he literally physically went to these places. His wife is amazing. She tolerates and takes delight in the things he does. I mean, one of his other books, The Puzzler, like she actually accompanied him around the globe to participate in some of these puzzles, the international puzzling competition that I believe took place in Portugal. And they came in second to last in the world when they were doing these jigsaw puzzles. They went for 8 hours and they weren't allowed to pee during that entire time because like they had to like stay on the puzzle. He brought his children. He's just, if I could become an AJ Jacobs scholar, I would. Like if that was a thing. In my mind, he's figured it out. He uses the wolf analogy as an internalized Mr. Rogers or a Larry David. We always have he says he's historically more of the Larry David type, and he's really been working hard to cultivate his authentic version of Mr. Rogers. No saccharine, it has to be authentic. And oh my gosh, I would love to remember some of the other places he went, but just trust me, read this book, read on your Kobo or Kindle before bed, notice how you sleep, and notice how much more gratitude you can find, because he basically shows us we can find it in the wackiest spaces. Amazing.
Yeah, I definitely appreciated this book. It did make me really appreciate my morning cup of coffee. And I'm thinking about him when I'm making my coffee in the morning. And so I appreciated the line of gratitude and where he went with it. And also, yeah, the pallets stood out to me too. Like I wouldn't even think about the pallets that carry
They make pallets in my little town. I knew that. Yeah.
No way.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Oh, cork.
Yeah.
I'm joking, but yeah.
So I thought that was a great, fun, extra pick, and obviously a good friend of yours, and all of his books have such a fun idea. So I was like, yeah, this is reminding me as we start in the new year to get back on some sort of gratitude practice. So I really appreciated this one. And thank you so much for chatting with us today.
Oh my gosh. I mean, and Tara, I just loved it. I mean, I loved our green room. I love the interview. The two of you are so on point, inquisitive. I mean, your listeners are really fortunate to be the beneficiaries of what you produce.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we have had a lot of fun with it, and it's been so fun getting to know you and chatting beforehand. And we have some sort of connection too with CIIS, which is a Bay Area psychology school. So that was really fun to hear. Can you share where listeners can find you online?
Absolutely. Just Google Adam Dorsay first off. You'll find all kinds of things. It's Dorsay, commonly misspelled. Obviously, it's AY, not EY. So like the museum in France, just without the apostrophe. dradamdorsay.com is my website. The TED Talks are easily findable on YouTube. And of course, on any platform where you listen to your podcasts, you can find Super Psyched with interviews with people like Steve Kerr, the Golden State Warriors head coach, or Temple Grandin, the internationally famous neurodiversity and autism specialist out of Colorado State University. Let's see, the most recent one was on near-death experiences. That one, and next week it's going to be all about friendship.
Thanks so much. We really appreciate your time.
Right back at you.
Thanks for listening to Books from Your Therapist. If you're interested in the books we talked about, we'll include links in our show notes. If you'd like to reach out to us with your own recommendations or are a mental health practitioner interested in coming on to share, you can email us at booksfromyourtherapist@gmail.com.
Happy finding your connection points.
Happy really appreciating your morning cup of coffee.
Java Joes.
Latte Larry.